I chose an article dealing with gender inequality, more specifically, gender inequality within the sports realm. The article talked about how gender inequality still plays a role in today's society in more ways than one. However, one specific way would obviously be within the sports realm. The gender wage gap continues to be heavily debated. In the sports industry, men and women continue to receive drastically different salaries for the same type of work. They could win the same competition, and the men's team would still receive far more than the women's teams would. The article also discusses unequal opportunities for both men and women within the sports industry. They explain the different types of inequalities within the industry, along with the historical background of the matter. They then describe how they personally feel on the issue and some ways that they believe it could be resolved by. Lastly, they discuss any objections and limitations on the matter. Now, explaining the inequalities and describing the background, the gap in pay is not only locally but international as well. One example is when the football men's team, the Germans, won the World Cup in 2014. They earned 44 times more than the Japanese women's football team did in 2011 for the same type of championship. An example of the wage gap locally would be within the USA basketball leagues, the WNBA and NBA. On average, men earn 81 times more than the women do, and the men also receive around 50% of their total earnings, while the women only receive around 30% of theirs. This type of inequality causes many women to not pursue their sports dreams due to such low pay wages. These are due to the revenues brought in from the leagues. The number of spectators also differs drastically between the two leagues. They believe that this is due to the historical, economic, and cultural factors. A little on the history. Women were looked to as being weak by some of the church reforms, and women also had to engage in unpaid labor and do all the household chores such as cooking, cleaning, taking care of the kids, things like that. Them having to do all of that left for no leisure time. But then women were first allowed to participate in gymnastics in England. That was the first sport. And although they were allowed to participate in it, many people still made objections, saying things like this could lead to hormonal imbalances or it could result in irreparable damages. And women also struggled to gain funding and resources for their sports. Some women received reduced training times and coaching compared to that of the men's. One of the obstacles that women face within sports is the lack of representation in decision making. It's mainly only men up there making all the decisions. There's not really a woman to speak for the women. And the technical quality of women's sports coverages is even lower than that of the men's. For example, the WNBA and NBA. The WNBA has far less promotions than the NBA does. And a little on the cultural norms. A lot of kids are growing up watching predominantly male sports and thinking that that's the norm. So them growing up watching that is going to just make it more normalized, and that's what causes such unlevel of a playing field. And one way that they think that this could be resolved by would be if the women's sports had the same type of exposure as the men's. In an objection to the claim of unequal pay, they talk about how some could say that the sports industry is a fair market and women just attract less sponsors and media attention than the men do. They could look at it as it being a race that men and women started equally and the men are just beating the women, when in reality their response to the objection would be that women didn't get an equal start. And the overall reasons for the unequal rights among the men's and women's sports teams are predominantly due to the historical, cultural, and economic factors.